Have you ever met someone who just handles things? Not someone who talks about handling things, not someone who posts about their mindset or their morning routine, just someone who quietly, consistently, without any fanfare, figures it out. No complaints, no drama, they just get on with it. There's a good chance that person is Generation X. Born between 1965 and 1980, Gen X is the generation that nobody really talks about. Sandwiched between the enormous cultural footprint of the baby boomers and the endless media coverage of millennials, they are the forgotten middle child of modern history. And yet, and this is what I find fascinating, they might be the most psychologically interesting generation of the 20th century. Because the way they think, the way they relate to the world, the way they handle adversity and independence and uncertainty did not happen by accident. It was shaped by a very specific set of circumstances. And today, I want to break that down for you. Because what I am going to show you is that the psychology of Generation X is not just about nostalgia or cultural references. It is about what happens to a person and an entire generation of people when they are raised to figure things out on their own. Part 2. The Latchkey Generation. Let us start here. Your brain is shaped by your environment, not just your adult environment, your childhood environment. The conditions you grew up in wire your nervous system in ways that stay with you for decades. And for Generation X, those conditions were unlike anything that came before or after. Gen X grew up during a period of massive social upheaval. Divorce rates in the United States doubled between the 1960s and the 1980s. More mothers were entering the workforce than ever before, and as a result, an enormous number of Gen X children came home from school to an empty house. They let themselves in with a key they wore around their neck. They made their own snacks, did their own homework, navigated their own problems, and waited for their parents to come home. They became known as the Latchkey Generation, and that experience of being alone, of having to self-regulate, of having to figure things out without an adult present, did something very specific to their psychology. It built what researchers call a high internal locus of control, the deeply wired belief that you are responsible for your own outcomes, that waiting for someone to save you is not a viable strategy, that the only reliable person in the room is yourself. Have you ever noticed that Gen X people tend to be remarkably self-sufficient? That they rarely ask for help, even when they need it? That is not stubbornness. That is a nervous system that learned very early that self-reliance was survival. Part 3. Skepticism as a coping mechanism. Now I want to talk about something that defines this generation perhaps more than anything else, and that is their relationship with institutions, with authority, and with the idea of being told what to think. Gen X grew up watching things fall apart. They watched Watergate, they watched the Cold War, they watched the AIDS crisis go largely ignored by their government. They watched corporations downsize and lay off their parents after decades of loyal service. They were promised that if you worked hard and played by the rules, the system would take care of you. And then they watched the system fail, repeatedly and publicly, to do exactly that. And so they developed something that researchers in generational psychology have consistently identified as a defining trait of Gen X: deep, structural skepticism. Not cynicism. There is an important difference. Cynicism says nothing will ever get better. Skepticism says, show me the evidence. Do not tell me to trust you. Earn it. This is why Gen X was the generation that built punk rock, grunge, and alternative culture. Not because they were angry for the sake of being angry, but because the mainstream offered them narratives that did not match reality, and they refused to pretend otherwise. Their art, their music, their entire cultural output was a refusal to perform optimism they did not feel. And here's what is interesting about that psychologically. Skepticism, when it is functional rather than destructive, is actually a remarkably healthy cognitive trait. Research in social psychology shows that people who maintain a critical relationship with authority and institutional messaging are more resilient in the face of manipulation, more adaptive in uncertain environments, and more likely to make decisions based on evidence rather than social pressure. Gen X did not know they were building a psychological armor, but they were. Part 4. The identity question. I want to bring this back to something I find absolutely central to understanding this generation, and that is the question of identity. Millennials were raised in an era of constant affirmation. Every child got a trophy. Every feeling was validated. Every dream was declared achievable. Gen X was not raised that way. Gen X was raised in an era where the prevailing message from adults was, essentially, figure it out. Nobody is coming to rescue you. The world does not owe you anything. Now that sounds harsh, and in some ways it was. But here is what it produced. A generation of people whose sense of self was not built on external validation, because external validation was not reliably available. It was built on action, on competence, on doing the thing and seeing that it worked. Behavioral psychology tells us that identity built through demonstrated competence is far more durable than identity built through affirmation. When your self-concept is rooted in what you have actually done, in problems you have actually solved, in adversity you have actually navigated, it does not collapse the moment someone stops telling you that you are great. It holds, because you know what you are made of. You have evidence. This is why Gen X tends to be extraordinarily resilient. Not because they feel good about themselves all the time. Many of them carry significant emotional weight that was never processed, because processing your feelings was not exactly encouraged in the 1970s and 80s. But because their foundation is built on something real, something they built themselves. Part 5. The Quiet Generation. There is something else I want to be honest about. Because this generation did not just inherit strength, they also inherited silence. Gen X grew up in an era before therapy was normalized, before emotional intelligence was a concept that appeared in mainstream conversation, before it was socially acceptable, especially for men, to say, "I am struggling, I need help, something is wrong." The message they received, overtly and subtly, was, deal with it, move on, do not make a scene. And so many of them did. They dealt with it. They moved on. They did not make a scene. And a lot of what they were carrying, grief, confusion, loneliness, the particular disorientation of growing up in a world that changed faster than anyone could process, got buried. Not resolved, buried. Research on emotional suppression consistently shows that unexpressed emotional experience does not disappear. It gets stored in the body, in behavioral patterns, in the ways we relate to the people closest to us. The stoicism of Gen X is real, and it is impressive. But underneath it, for many of them, is a reservoir of feeling that was never given permission to exist. And what is happening now, as this generation moves into their 40s and 50s, is that many of them are finally beginning to excavate that. In therapy, in relationships, in the very act of watching their own children be raised in an entirely different emotional climate and feeling, sometimes, a complicated mixture of pride and grief for the child they once were. Part 6. Close. Here is what I want you to take from this. Generation X was shaped by neglect and by freedom, by institutions that failed them, and by the self-reliance they built in response, by a world that moved too fast and asked too little of the adults who were supposed to be in charge. And out of all of that, they built something remarkable. A quiet, durable, deeply competent way of moving through the world. They are not the loudest generation. They do not dominate the cultural conversation the way boomers do or the way millennials do. But they are, in many ways, the most psychologically honest. They have very little patience for performance, for pretending things are fine when they are not, for narratives that do not match reality. And in a world that is drowning in performance, in curated images, in optimism that is not rooted in anything real, that particular quality feels more valuable than ever. If you are Gen X, I hope this gave you a language for something you have always felt, but perhaps never quite put into words. And if you are not, if you are millennial or Gen Z or boomer, I hope it gave you a window into a generation that deserves far more attention than it gets. Leave a comment below. I want to know. Do you think Gen X is the most underrated generation? And why? Thank you for watching. Subscribe if you want more, and I will see you in the next one.